In this lesson, we're going to explore the scientific explanations for change over time. Our learning objectives for this lesson include that you can explain early ideas humans had about how living things change over time, that you can explain the principles of natural selection, and that you can describe or explain the rates or methods at which biological change occurs over time. Let's start with the ideas of Lamarck. We generally just call him by his last name. His whole name was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He was French. Jean is like the English version of John. So in the early 1800s, he proposed that species evolved by keeping any traits that were beneficial, that means good, and any characteristics that were not used or were intentionally not used were lost from the species. So he basically believed that acquired traits could be passed on from parent to offspring, and that over time, this would change a species. Eventually, unused traits would leave the organism. You have to remember that at this time, people did not know about DNA, and they didn't know what genes were, so it seems like a really kind of silly idea to us, but at this time, it was the best that they could do with the knowledge that they had. Basically, the study of genetics put Lamarck's idea to rest for good. It proved his hypothesis incorrect once we understood the mechanisms of inheritance, which you guys just studied in the last unit. So here's some examples of what Lamarck believed. If we go back to the giraffe example here, right, he believed that giraffes really could stretch their necks by reaching for those higher leaves, and if they did that enough over their lifetimes, those genes, if he even used that word, could be passed on to the giraffe children. Or another example is a blacksmith, someone who's pounding on metal a lot in his lifetime builds up a lot of strength and muscle, and his sons would have similar muscular development. That was their hypothesis, that what he did during his lifetime to increase his muscles could then be passed to his children. Another example that still persists for quite a long time is cropping dogs' ears. Cropping is actually cutting a dog's ears. So for instance, in these Dobermans, the dog's born with floppy ears. And for aesthetic value or for whatever reason, they wanted the ears to stand upright. So to get them to do that, they have to cut the ear. But they thought that if they did that enough times, that eventually the ears would just be born like that. Same with tails on dogs. Here's a Rottweiler, right? We're used to seeing this shape or profile of a dog. That's because they cut the tail off. But this is what it would normally look with, the actual tail. They thought if they did that enough times that dogs would eventually be born with the desired trait or characteristic they were looking for. In the mid to late 1800s, an Englishman named Charles Darwin started to hypothesize an idea that individuals that had traits that are advantageous, good, for a specific environment survived and passed on those traits to their offspring. So he ended up calling that idea natural selection. So more to say about this, but it basically means that only organisms with the traits best suited for their environments are more likely to survive. For instance, this leaf bug, right? Well adapted to its environment because it blends in, it looks like a leaf. Or for instance, this birdbeak is a very good adaptation for getting nectar from up inside these flowers. Darwin initially came up with this theory while he traveled to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are this tiny group of islands. They're all volcanically created off the west side of South America, in present-day Ecuador. And basically, he was seeing all kinds of variety of life forms here that hadn't been seen or described before. At this time in history, countries like England and Spain and France would put people on ships to accompany ships that were out trading and exploring the world. And the naturalists would explain what they saw, bring back samples. It basically was there to study the life that they encountered. You don't have to write this down, it's underlined. This is the name of the ship that he traveled on, the HMS Beagle. HMS stands for Her Majesty's Ship. And it was a ship like this that he would have sailed on to the Galapagos. There's a wonderful movie that does not talk about Darwin directly. Maybe you've seen it, called Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. It's got Russell Crowe in it. And he plays one of these ship captains who is out exploring the world for England. And there is a Darwin-like character in that movie clip. And here's just a little bit of that. Now to a short clip on some of the interesting life forms that you would find at the Galapagos Islands. These are the finches that Darwin is famous for studying that are from those Galapagos Islands. He made the hypothesis that these finches probably all came from one ancestor that would be found on the mainland of South America. And over time, when there was different conditions on these islands, different food available, and you can see that here, insects, buds, cactus flowers, and seeds, that those birds evolved into different species of birds, partly due to the food source available and having beaks that were adapted to eating those food sources. And now when we look at all the present day finches, they are separate species. Darwin did not come to this idea quickly. He actually spent his whole life thinking about it, writing about it, talking about it, and he ended up publishing a book actually near the end of his life called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in the book, he outlines the 4 factors that control natural selection. They are, number 1, that organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So for instance, this is a picture of tadpoles. Is every single one of those tadpoles going to grow into an adult frog? Probably not. Some are going to get eaten by other organisms. Some are going to just not be the best swimmers or whatever to live in their environment. Same with these apple seeds. Not every single one of them is going to grow into a new apple tree. Some are going to get broken down and degenerate. Some are going to possibly become apple seeds, but not all of them. But organisms tend to make a lot of babies, basically, in hopes that 1 or 2 or a few will survive. Secondly, he said there are variations found among individuals of a species. So when you look at one member compared to another member, assuming these birds are the same species, they're not exactly alike. Some look different from each other. It's natural to have that variation. What are some of the variations you see between these 2 birds? Hopefully, you notice this one has a slightly longer beak than this one. There's also some different coloring on the bellies. This one has some shading on its belly, this one does not. This one has a slightly larger forked back wing compared to this one. This one has a larger claw than the other one. Slightly different facial or head markings. Could one of those, or more than one of those traits be advantageous? Maybe. We don't know what conditions are like in the environment, but maybe. Some variations enable members of a population to survive and reproduce better than others. We're showing reproduction here. This lioness has mated and produced a cub which she's carrying in her mouth, right? Only really the organisms that have those good beneficial adaptations, whatever they may be, are surviving and passing on their traits. If you're not well adapted to your environment, you will die. And that's basically the idea of survival of the fittest. The fittest are those that match their environment. Number 4, over time, offspring, babies, children of individuals with helpful variation make up more and more of the population. And you can imagine the ones with the unhelpful variation die off. So here's what natural selection is in a nutshell. If the environment, in this case for the beetles, is selecting green beetles, the crows are eating all the green beetles, maybe because they can see them better, then it's a good thing to be a different color. It's a good thing to be an orange beetle. So over time, the beetle population is going to change. So you're going to end up with more orange beetles and not very many green beetles, because that was what was favorable in the environment.
Dear Tim and Moby, how does natural selection work? From Fred D. Many species have come and gone during Earth's history. For instance, there are no more dinosaurs. By the same token, when dinosaurs walked the Earth, there were no people yet. Well, that's natural selection at work. Sure, but first, I gotta tell you a story. Back in the 1800s, a scientist named Charles Darwin went on an historic expedition to the Galapagos Islands and noticed something strange about the birds there. Each of the islands had its own unique species of finch. They were all very similar to one another, but their beaks were radically different sizes and shapes. On islands with lots of fruit trees, the finches had beaks that were useful for eating fruit. On islands with a lot of insects, the finches had thin beaks that could pick up a single bug. And so on. This got Darwin thinking. Eventually, he decided that all of the finches could have easily come from a common ancestor and become more specialized to suit their environments. The end. I'll explain. You just have to understand some stuff first. Life isn't always easy. Living things always have to compete for resources. Even in the nicest environment, there may be a shortage of food or water or even space. And a lot of plants and animals have to worry about being eaten. All of these things are called environmental pressures. Got that? Now, in any given population of plants or animals, there are always variations. Look at a family of brothers and sisters. You'll see what I mean. Nobody's exactly the same. Right, except for maybe twins. Some variations, called mutations, can be passed on to your kids. These mutations can be caused by mistakes that happen when your DNA copies itself, or by outside influences like radiation or chemicals. So what do mutations have to do with environmental pressures? Well, imagine a coral reef with some little green fish living near it. There's a big fish that lives there too, and he likes to eat the little fish. As with any population of animals, the green fish have their share of mutations. Some mutations aren't so good. Other mutations, however, can be seen as favorable. A fish the same color as the reef is harder to spot, so it's less likely to get eaten. It has a better chance of living long enough to reproduce. And if it passes on its colors to its offspring, then over time the entire population may be the same color as the reef, as the brighter fish succumb to the environmental pressure of being eaten. This system of natural selection is sometimes called survival of the fittest, and it's the driving force behind the theory of evolution. These changes can take various amounts of time. Some are quick, and some take millions of years. Still, natural selection is pretty hard to miss. Just look at the variety of life on Earth caused by the different environmental pressures. One neat consequence of the theory of evolution is that all life on Earth is connected. Some scientists would even say that if you pick any two living things and go back far enough in time, you'll find that they have a common ancestor, just like Darwin's finches. In his book, The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin compares the almost endless complexity of life to a massive tree. Some branches don't work out, and they drop off, becoming extinct. Other branches thrive and become trees in their own right and contribute to the amazing diversity of life. I can totally see you. Yes, I can.
One common misconception to be aware of, organisms cannot choose or wish for what they need to survive. They are either born with the helpful variations and adaptations, or they are not. Sometimes they might be born with good adaptations for one environment, and then the environment changes, and they don't have the right adaptations to succeed in that changed environment. So you can see here with the beavers, right? Beavers are normally used to gnawing on trees to make their beaver dams. This beaver, any beaver, cannot wish for a chainsaw appendage that would help it cut down trees faster. It doesn't work that way. So Darwin's theories are widely accepted today. They're one of the most important concepts in life science, and we will continue to explore this idea going further.